Hi guys, okay, this is Firoujza against Duda from Tata Chess 2021, round 7. A bit of background on Duda. He was a chess prodigy, grandmaster at 15, and at age 22 is currently the strongest Polish player in the world and ranked number 19 globally when this game was played. Firoujza had white and opened with d4, and then we had Firoujza's most common opening at the moment, which is a similar setup to what we saw in his third round game against Giugiaro. He's just developing naturally and going for a London system type setup. Knight bd2 and now castles, and note that Firoujza isn't afraid of bishop takes f4, e takes f4, because now he gets a nice bind on the e5 and he can play for f5 later, effectively repairing his pawn structure. So Duda castled, and then Firoujza centralized immediately with his knight, and he has ideas of playing knight df3 next and reinforce this knight on e5, and Duda responded with c5, so he's striking immediately at the white center, and Firoujza reinforced it, and then came queen c7 and bishop d3, and this is a pretty standard London system setup. And it's somewhat popular at the top level recently, despite having a fairly unambitious reputation. So b6, Duda's preparing bishop a6 to trade off this light squared bishop, because it's often a great attacking piece for white in these setups, and the black light squared bishop is unable to counter the white light squared bishop's pressure on the king side. So next came h4, and similarly to allowing bishop takes f4 a few moves earlier, this is another move that many beginners would be weary to play, but Firoujza is of course no beginner. So bishop a6, and Firoujza trades in order to not lose time. So knight takes a6 and now h5, just pressing forwards with h pawn and stretching out this rook. So knight d7, and there's no doubt that black has to directly challenge white's central control with moves like this, and then later f6, otherwise he's just going to get mowed down on the king side. And as usual, it's often correct to counter in the center when you're getting attacked on the flank. So knight df3, and after f6, knight d3 and c takes d4, just opening the c file for the queen and maybe later a rook. Although the engine thinks that this is a small error from Duda, preferring instead c4. And after a more or less forcing line like this, is pretty much an equal game for black from this position. But c takes d4 is what Duda played. And now knight takes d4, and perhaps Duda was expecting the pawn capture, after which he's doing alright. But after this capture with the knight, white is threatening both knight b5, which is going to win a piece because of the pressure on the bishop and the queen, and also threatening knight takes e6, winning a pawn and the exchange. So of course Duda's seen this, and he responds with e5, immediately pushing in the center while white remains uncastled. And this is effectively giving up the exchange for this great center and activity, which is a very creative choice. So knight e6, queen c4, and we can see that Duda's probably considered all of this when he plays c takes d4, and he wants to get his queen to this good square. So knight takes f8, the bishop takes f8, bishop g3, and knight c d5. And Duda's idea is either to force the trade here, after which white has difficulty castling because the queen is blocking the king, or to force the knight to retreat. So Firoujza opted for the former, knight takes c5. So knight takes c5, and now white has this problem where he can't castle despite being the exchange up, but black has gained a lot of space in the center and he can get active. So rook h4, hitting the queen, so e4, this is the best move. Now queen e2, offering a queen trade, which Duda obviously doesn't want to go for because he has the exchange down, and that will be felt a lot more keenly after the queens come off the board. And he's obviously played to get his knight d3, so knight d3 check, king f1, and black does have decent compensation for the exchange here and the pressure on the b2 pawn, because the queen isn't defending it if the knight takes, because it's pinned to the king. And with that in mind, Duda played f5 now. because white can win a pawn back if he takes on b2 straight away. So knight takes b2, queen takes c4, knight takes c4. Now rook d1, and how does black defend d5? There's no rook d8 because of rook takes e4, and suddenly white's winning. So Duda defends the e4 pawn before, well, to create the threat of taking on b2, and to respond to that, Firoujza breaks the pin with king g1. So now the queen is defending b2. So rook c8, and perhaps with the idea of playing b5, b4 later, and prizing open the queen side here. So rook h1 from Firoujza, who takes the time to regroup and improve his pieces. Now king f7 from Duda. He's also improving his overall position, bringing his king to the center to defend this weak d5 pawn. And Firoujza now finished castling by hand. King h2, so bishop e7. a3, which is a useful prophylactic move against a later b4. Firoujza is taking calm positional measures before undertaking anything more committal. So b5, rook ad1, king e6, and now Firoujza decides to take clear action with rook takes d3, which is a little surprising because the engine prefers to continue improving. With, for example, rook d2, now a5, rook h, d1, g6, rook takes d3, e takes d3, rook takes d3, and white is going into a favorable endgame. So rook takes d3, and queen takes d3, queen takes d3, e takes d3, and rook d1. It appears that white's going to win a pawn, and this must be why Firoujza was happy to trade on d3 a few moves earlier. But now Duda found the nice continuation as recommended by the engine with bishop takes a3, and after b takes a3, rook takes c3. So he's got 2 pawns for the bishop and good chances of drawing the game. Firoujza played king g1 now, which is giving up another pawn. He can of course defend it with the rook a1 instead, but Firoujza rightly prefers to keep his pieces active. So king g1, now rook takes a3, king f1. He's going to bring his king over to the queen side to help defend where black is now active. So b4, and white does now have to be careful because b3 is a huge threat with the simple idea playing b2 and rook a1, and how does white defend against that? But Firoujza has obviously seen this coming. He plays king e1, so that after b3 and king d2 he's able to hold all of the squares and defend, and the position is now completely equal. But Duda blundered with b2 now, which hands Firoujza a slight edge. He should play instead a5 with the threat of b2, rook b1, and after rook b3 just a5, a4, and it's a very simple win. The problem is that after his move b2, rook b1 and rook b3, because b2 has been played before a5, white now has bishop c7 to prevent this a5 pawn move, and this is a crucial prophylactic move to stop a5 from being played, and a potential rerouting of the bishop to c3 to pick up the b2 pawn. So white now maintains a small edge, and Duda temporarily sacked a pawn to get his king active with d4, and after e takes d4, king d5, and now f4 from Firoujza to support a later bishop e5 and add pressure to the b2 pawn. Duda didn't want to allow this with king takes d4 immediately, so he played instead g6, and now Firoujza closed up the king side with h6. So king takes d4, and then bishop e5 check, king e4, and now bishop takes b2. Of course, if rook takes b2, then it's just going to be a draw after the rooks come off. So rook b7, rook e1 check, king takes f4, and now bishop e5 check. Firoujza finds the only move to retain the smallest of edges for the rest of the endgame. So king g4, and now king takes d3, and black has 2 pawns for the bishop, and although white has an edge, this should still be objectively drawn. So g5, and black advances his pawn majority. Makes sense for him to advance in this area of the board because that's where his pawn majority is. So bishop d4, it's taking aim at a7, rook d7 is pinning the bishop, and now rook e6, which is a nice accurate move that prevents rook d6 in order to take aim at h6. If instead white gets greedy and plays rook a1, black is holding the balance. After rook d6, rook takes a7, sorry, and rook takes h6. So rook e6, and now king g3, and rook f6, attacking the f pawn. So king g4, rook a6, and f4. This is a clear mistake from Duda because it allows king e4. Better was king g3, and after rook takes a7, rook d6, rook takes h7, king takes g2, and this is again probably a draw. So f4, king e4, and now suddenly white is close to winning with ideas like bishop f6 and rook a5 to attack this weak g5 pawn. So rook e7 check, bishop e5, again the only move to retain the advantage. And now rook b7. And Duda clearly wanted to keep active, but this is another small mistake. King g3 was better, although white is still winning. So rook b7, and now bishop f6, and rook a5 is now a huge threat. So rook b4 check draws the bishop back and removes the pressure from the g5 pawn at the price of leaving the defense of the a7 pawn. So bishop d4, king h5, and now rook d6, and Firoujza is playing the endgame with pinpoint accuracy. This supports the bishop and enables king f5 and later bishop e5, after which Duda will suddenly be faced with mating threats. Taking the a7 pawn instead would again lead to a draw after rook takes a7 and king takes h6. So rook d6, and now rook a4, which is another mistake from Duda, but he's lost now in any case. As can often happen in the endgame, a small edge has been turned into a winning position after a couple of small mistakes. So king f5, rook a2. Black has no defense here. If instead rook a5 check, just bishop e5, and white has a force mate with ideas like rook d3, h3, or rook d1, h1, and black can't defend the back rank because the bishop is covering the a1 square. So very nice piece coordination from Firoujza. So rook a2, now bishop f6, again the best move. So king takes h6, and now rook d1, and this is forcing mate, so Duda resigned here. He can play rook a5, just give a spite check, but it's changing nothing after bishop e5 with the threat of rook h1, and this is actually forcing black to give up the exchange and therefore the game. So it was another brilliant game from Firoujza. I hope you enjoyed it. Smash those like and subscribe buttons if you did, and I'll see you next time.